Welcome to our channel, where exciting and inspiring stories come to life. Here, you will find stories of overcoming, surprising twists and lessons that touch the heart. We believe in the power of stories to transform perspectives. If you like good stories, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and activate the notification bell so you never miss our releases. And of course, share your opinions in the comments. We want to hear from you and how we can continue to bring you even more exciting stories.
Richard Davenport had always been a man who commanded respect. From the polished leather of his Italian shoes to the sharp crease of his tailored suits, he epitomized the power and privilege of old money America. Born and raised in the affluent suburbs of Connecticut, Richard was the patriarch of one of the East Coast's most formidable financial dynasties. His company, Davenport Holdings, had a sprawling portfolio that included banks, real estate ventures, and investment funds that stretched from New York to Los Angeles. But beyond the boardrooms and conference calls, Richard was known for something else: an unyielding adherence to tradition and a worldview shaped by exclusivity. His son James had been raised in the shadow of this legacy. Growing up, James was groomed to take over the family business one day, expected to uphold not just the company's reputation but the Davenport name itself. But James had never fit perfectly into the mold Richard had cast for him. He was sharp and capable, but he possessed a warmth and empathy that set him apart from the cold, calculating world of finance. He chose to pursue a career in public policy, working to create more equitable housing initiatives. It was a career path Richard tolerated but privately derided as lacking ambition. Things changed dramatically when James met Amara Johnson. Amara was everything Richard hadn't anticipated: a brilliant and driven doctor specializing in rare cardiac diseases, known not just for her intelligence but for her kindness and humility. She was also the daughter of immigrants, growing up in a vibrant, close-knit community in Chicago that celebrated resilience and diversity. When James brought Amara to meet his family during a formal dinner at their sprawling estate, Richard's reaction was immediate and cold. Richard sat at the head of the long mahogany table, its polished surface gleaming under the chandelier's light. The room was filled with antique furniture, oil paintings of stern-faced Davenports from generations past, and an air of practiced luxury. Amara walked in wearing an elegant dress that highlighted her grace, her dark hair pulled back, revealing the warmth in her brown eyes. She exuded confidence but felt a slight tension as the servants moved around, placing platters of food on the table. James, beside her, squeezed her hand gently under the table, a gesture of reassurance. Richard's gaze swept over Amara, taking in every detail with a scrutinizing look. His eyes, a cold blue that mirrored the icy winters of New England, held no warmth. He raised his glass to signal the start of the meal, and the clinking sound echoed in the silence. "So, Miss Johnson," Richard began, his voice smooth but laced with the faintest hint of disdain, "James has spoken highly of you. A doctor, I hear." "Yes, Mr. Davenport," Amara replied, forcing herself to maintain eye contact. "I specialize in rare heart conditions. It's a demanding field, but I find it incredibly fulfilling." Richard's lips curled slightly in what might have been mistaken for a smile. "Admirable work," he said, but his tone implied otherwise. He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under the shift. "And your family?" James mentioned they're originally from Ghana, sir. "My parents immigrated to the U.S. before I was born. They built a life for themselves in Chicago, where I grew up," Amara said, her voice steady but aware of the unspoken tension. Richard's gaze hardened imperceptibly. The conversation moved on, but the dinner became a battlefield of subtle jabs and dismissive comments. He asked about her upbringing with a tone that suggested it was a novelty, not a story worth telling. He listened to her achievements with a forced politeness, always steering the conversation back to topics that underscored his own accomplishments or the family's legacy. Amara, for her part, maintained her composure, but each question felt like a test she was destined to fail in his eyes. James knew his father well enough to recognize the signs. The slight narrowing of his eyes, the way he tightened his jaw when he was displeased. As dinner concluded, Richard made no attempt to hide his disapproval. "James," he said, summoning his son into the study after Amara had excused herself to speak with James's mother, a woman who had long since learned to blend into the background. The study was Richard's domain, a room filled with the scent of aged leather and old books. It was here that business deals were brokered, alliances forged, and ultimatums delivered. "Father," James said, trying to keep his voice steady as he entered the room. Richard closed the heavy oak door, the click resounding like a gavel striking wood. "This relationship," Richard began, waving a hand dismissively, "is a mistake. Have you considered what this will do to our reputation? To the Davenport name?" James clenched his fists at his sides. "Amara is the most brilliant, kind, and capable person I've ever met. This isn't about reputation, it's about love." Richard's eyes flared with anger. "Love," he scoffed, the words sounding foreign in his mouth. "Do you really believe that's enough to sustain the legacy of this family? To maintain our influence and status?" He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a cold whisper. "I will not allow this family to be diluted by sentiment or misaligned choices." James felt a rush of anger, so intense it nearly took his breath away. "Your legacy, father, is nothing without integrity. If you can't see that, then I pity you." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the steady tick of the grandfather clock. Richard's face hardened, and he turned away. "Then you leave me no choice, James. If you go through with this, you are no longer my son." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. James took a step back, his expression a mix of shock and defiance. Without another word, he left the room, finding Amara in the hallway, her face softening as she looked at him. "Are you okay?" she asked, sensing the tension that radiated from him. James nodded, forcing a smile. "Let's go home." As they drove back to their apartment in the city, the weight of Richard's ultimatum settled heavily on James's shoulders. Amara reached for his hand, and though he didn't say it out loud, her touch reminded him that he was making the right choice, no matter the cost. Meanwhile, back in the estate study, Richard stood alone, staring out the window at the manicured gardens that stretched beyond. His reflection in the glass looked older than he remembered, the lines on his face deepened by anger and something else he refused to name. In the silence of the room, he felt the sting of something that resembled doubt. But he pushed it away, convincing himself that his decision was justified, that he was protecting the family's name. Little did he know that the woman he had just humiliated would one day be the key to his survival. In the months following the confrontation at the Davenport estate, life took on a new rhythm for James and Amara. It was a rhythm that pulsed with love and resilience, but carried an undercurrent of loss. They married in a small, intimate ceremony attended by friends and those family members who could look past the boundaries Richard had drawn. The absence of James's father was palpable, a silent wound that they both learned to navigate without letting it define their happiness. Amara's career at the hospital flourished. She became known not only for her skill, but for her compassion. Patients came to her with cases that other doctors found too complex or hopeless, but Amara took them on with tireless determination. It was as though she were channeling all the hurt and dismissal from Richard into a wellspring of motivation to prove herself, not to him, but to the world and to herself. James, too, found fulfillment in his work advocating for housing reforms. He poured his energy into developing programs that provided resources to marginalized communities, a cause close to his heart and one that had first brought him and Amara together. Their apartment in New York City, modest by Davenport standards but warm and filled with laughter, became a place of refuge. It was adorned with trinkets from their travels and bookshelves lined with medical journals and policy papers. Friends gathered there for dinners, their conversations filled with ideas and debates rather than pretension. But no matter how much life carried them forward, there was always a shadow. James still felt the sting of his father's disapproval, especially during quiet moments when he allowed himself to remember the life he had left behind. Every so often, he would receive a terse message from his mother, Elizabeth Davenport, who continued to live in Richard's imposing shadow. The notes were never personal, just brief updates or birthday cards signed only by her. They spoke of duty rather than warmth, reinforcing the walls that Richard had built around himself and his legacy. One evening, Amara returned home after a particularly long shift at the hospital. She dropped her bag by the door and stretched, the tension in her muscles giving way as she caught sight of James reading on the couch. He looked up and smiled, the lines around his eyes crinkling in a way that always made her heart soften. "Tough day?" he asked, putting down his book. Amara nodded, sinking onto the couch beside him. "We lost a patient today. It was a tough case, a young man with a heart condition we couldn't manage in time." James reached for her hand, the weight of her day mirrored in his empathetic expression. "I'm sorry, Amara. You did everything you could." "I know," she whispered, leaning into him. "But it never gets easier." They sat in silence for a moment, their breathing synchronized as they found solace in each other's presence. James glanced at a framed photo on the shelf, a candid shot of them at a park, taken not long after they first met. It was a reminder of simpler times, before family legacies and personal conflicts complicated their lives. Meanwhile, across town in his estate, Richard Davenport sat alone in his study. The large, dimly lit room felt even more cavernous at night. He was going over financial reports, as he often did, seeking the comfort of numbers and facts that never betrayed him. But tonight, something was different. His hand trembled as he tried to sip from a glass of scotch, and a sharp, sudden pain lanced through his chest. It passed quickly, but it was enough to make him pause. He set the glass down, trying to steady his breathing. For a moment, he felt a pang of fear, an unfamiliar emotion that he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge in years. The walls of the study seemed to close in, and Richard's mind wandered, unbidden, to thoughts of James and the life his son had chosen, one filled with purpose and love that Richard could not understand. The thought irritated him, so he pushed it away, convincing himself it was weakness, nothing more. A few weeks later, Elizabeth Davenport finally convinced Richard to attend a high-profile charity gala, an event that promised to bolster the family's public image and connect them with other influential figures. Richard agreed reluctantly, knowing that appearances had to be maintained, even if his body was beginning to show signs of rebellion. The pain in his chest had returned sporadically, each time more intense than before, but he kept it to himself. He wasn't ready to admit vulnerability, not to Elizabeth, not to anyone. The gala was held in a grand ballroom with towering chandeliers and tables draped in white linens. The room buzzed with chatter and the clinking of glasses as New York's elite mingled. Richard stood by a marble column, feeling disconnected from the event despite the familiar faces and flattering conversations. "Mr. Davenport, it's a pleasure to see you again," a voice interrupted his thoughts. It belonged to an investment partner, a man who spoke with the practiced enthusiasm of someone who always had something to gain. Richard nodded curtly, feeling the pain flare again. This time, it didn't pass as quickly. His vision blurred, and he gripped the edge of the column to steady himself. Panic flickered in his eyes as he tried to keep his composure. The partner's smile faltered as he noticed Richard's pallor. "Are you all right, sir?" the man asked, his voice tinged with concern. But before Richard could respond, the room tilted, and everything went dark. He woke up hours later in a hospital room, the sterile smell of antiseptic and the soft beeping of monitors surrounding him. Elizabeth sat beside his bed, her normally composed face creased with worry. A doctor stood near the foot of the bed, flipping through Richard's chart. "You're awake, Mr. Davenport," the doctor said, his voice measured. "You had a cardiac event. It's a rare condition, one that requires specialized treatment." Richard's eyes, still adjusting to the harsh light, met Elizabeth's. For the first time in years, he saw a genuine fear in her eyes that matched his own. "Specialized treatment?" Richard repeated, his voice weak. "Yes," the doctor confirmed. "We've consulted with some of the best cardiologists, but there's one name that keeps coming up as the leading expert in this particular field. Dr. Amara Johnson." The name dropped into the room like a stone into still water, sending ripples through Richard's mind. His jaw tightened instinctively, but beneath the surface of his pride and resistance, something else stirred, something that resembled dread. Elizabeth, sensing his tension, spoke up. "Richard, if she's the best, we need her." The words sat heavily between them, spoken by the woman who had always supported him in silence. For the first time, Richard had no retort, no argument to push back. All he could feel was the painful realization that he might need help from the very person he had rejected so cruelly. As the doctor stepped out to make arrangements, Richard lay back against the pillows, staring at the ceiling with unseeing eyes. The faint beeping of the heart monitor was a reminder of how fragile everything was: power, pride, legacy. In that moment, stripped of all pretense, Richard Davenport was nothing more than an old man staring down the consequences of a life ruled by arrogance. And somewhere in the city, the woman he had belittled and humiliated held the power not just over his heart, but over his future. The night James received the phone call, it was already late. He was sitting at their dining table, reviewing documents for an upcoming policy meeting, while Amara was curled up on the couch, finally taking a break after a long day at the hospital. The glow of the city lights filtered through their apartment windows, casting soft, shifting patterns on the walls. When James's phone rang, both of them glanced at it, expecting it to be a routine call. But when James saw the name Elizabeth Davenport flash across the screen, his heart sank. He hadn't heard directly from his mother in months. With a wary glance at Amara, who raised an eyebrow at the unexpected call, James picked up. "Hello," James said, his voice guarded. "James, it's your father. He's in the hospital." Elizabeth's voice came through the line, tight with worry. James felt his breath catch in his throat. "What happened?" "It was a heart attack, but it's more complicated than that. The doctors say he has a rare cardiac condition. They need someone specialized, someone who can handle a case like this." There was a pause, and then Elizabeth added, "They said Amara is one of the only doctors qualified to treat him." James felt the room spin for a moment. He turned to Amara, whose face had lost its relaxed expression and was now serious, attentive. "It's about my father," he mouthed, and she sat up straight, setting her book aside. "James, please." Elizabeth's voice trembled, breaking through his thoughts. "We need her." James closed his eyes, the weight of the request pressing down on him like an iron hand. He opened them again to meet Amara's gaze. Without speaking, she walked over and sat beside him, taking his free hand into hers. "I'll talk to her," James said finally, the words heavy with conflicted emotions. "We'll call you back." After he ended the call, the silence between them was thick, each of them grappling with the implications. Amara broke it first, her voice steady but soft. "Your father is sick?" James nodded, his expression torn between concern and bitterness. "He had a heart attack. But it's more than that, it's serious, and they want you to be the lead on his case." Amara's eyes widened slightly, and she exhaled a deep breath. "They know about me?" James's voice lowered. "Yes. The doctors recommended you." The room fell silent again as Amara considered the situation. It was surreal to think that the same man who had rejected and humiliated her might now need her help to survive. The memory of that night at the Davenport estate flashed in her mind, the cold, dismissive stare Richard had given her, the unspoken belief that she was not good enough. It was a wound she had carried for years, one that had fueled her drive to succeed but also left scars she rarely acknowledged. She looked at James, seeing the storm of emotions flicker across his face. His father's rejection had cut him deeply, even if he tried to hide it. But beneath the anger and hurt, she could see the concern in his eyes, an instinctual love that he couldn't simply switch off, no matter how estranged they were. "James," she said quietly, "what do you want me to do?" He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Part of me wants to say forget it, that he doesn't deserve your help after everything he's done. But another part of me," he hesitated, searching for the right words. "I can't just watch him die knowing there's a chance, no matter how slim, that he could be saved. And if that chance depends on you, then I have to ask." Amara nodded slowly. The weight of the decision settled heavily in her chest. She had always believed in the power of forgiveness and the duty she had as a doctor to save lives, regardless of who the patient was. But this was different. This was personal. Yet, as she sat there, she realized that saying no would mean turning her back not just on Richard, but on James, on everything she stood for. "I'll do it," she said, her voice steady but tinged with resolve. "But not for him. For you. And for myself." James felt a swell of emotion rise in his chest, a mixture of gratitude, guilt, and love. He pulled her into a tight embrace, whispering, "Thank you, Amara. You don't know what this means." The next morning, Amara arrived at the hospital. The atmosphere was familiar yet surreal, knowing that the patient she was about to treat was the man who had dismissed her so thoroughly years before. She walked down the sterile white hallway, her heels clicking against the polished floor, each step a reminder that she was here as a professional, not as a woman wounded by the past. Elizabeth met her at the entrance to Richard's room, her face pale and lined with worry. She looked at Amara with eyes that held a complex mix of emotions: hope, shame, gratitude. "Thank you for coming, Dr. Johnson," she said, using Amara's title, a sign of the respect that Richard had always denied her. Amara nodded once, acknowledging Elizabeth's words but maintaining her professional distance. "I'm here for the patient, Mrs. Davenport. Let's focus on his recovery." Elizabeth glanced at the door, then back at Amara, and nodded. "He's waiting inside." Amara pushed open the door to Richard's room and was met with the steady beep of monitors and the faint hum of medical machinery. Richard lay in the hospital bed, his face pale and gaunt, a stark contrast to the powerful image he had always presented. His eyes opened as she stepped inside, and for a moment, they met hers with something between disbelief and resentment. "Amara," Richard said, his voice weak but still holding an edge. It was the first time he had ever said her name. "Yes, Mr. Davenport," she replied, setting down her clipboard and looking directly at him. "I'm here to discuss your condition and the treatment plan." There was a pause as Richard tried to muster the pride he had always wielded like a weapon, but it faltered. The reality of his situation left him no room for arrogance. "They said, you're the only one who can handle this." Amara's expression remained composed. "I'm familiar with your case. It's complicated, but we have options. However, this will require full cooperation and trust." Richard's jaw clenched, and a flicker of the old defiance surfaced in his eyes before it was extinguished by the weakness that overtook him. "Do what you must," he said finally, each word weighed down with reluctant acceptance. Amara nodded, maintaining her professional demeanor. She began outlining the treatment plan, the medical terms rolling off her tongue with ease. But beneath the clinical details and professional tone, a war raged inside her, a struggle between the old wounds Richard had inflicted and the deep-rooted compassion that defined her. As she left the room after briefing him, Amara paused in the hallway, exhaling a shaky breath. Elizabeth approached her, eyes full of unsaid words. "I don't know how to thank you," Elizabeth said softly. "You don't have to," Amara replied, her voice gentle but firm. "Just understand that this isn't easy for any of us." Elizabeth nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. For the first time, she reached out and squeezed Amara's hand, a silent acknowledgement of the sacrifices being made. As Amara walked down the hallway to begin the first phase of Richard's treatment, she felt the weight of the past pressing against her, but she also felt something else, a quiet, unyielding strength that told her she was exactly where she needed to be, not just for Richard, but for herself. The first days of Richard's treatment were marked by an uneasy silence. He lay in his hospital bed, connected to an array of monitors and IVs, while Amara oversaw his care with the precision and dedication she was known for. Each time she entered the room, the tension was palpable. Richard's eyes would follow her movements, filled with a mix of defiance and reluctant acceptance. It was clear that his pride remained, albeit weakened by the pain and fragility of his condition. Amara, for her part, maintained her professionalism. She treated him like any other patient, running through protocols and adjusting treatments as needed. But beneath the clinical precision was an awareness that this wasn't just another case. Every time she looked at Richard, memories of his cutting words surfaced, reminding her why this task felt heavier than any she had faced before. One afternoon, as the sunlight filtered through the hospital blinds, casting slanted shadows across the room, Amara stood at the foot of Richard's bed, discussing the next phase of his treatment. Richard's eyes met hers with a hardness that hadn't completely faded. "Why did you agree to this?" he asked suddenly, his voice rough from disuse but carrying the same pointed sharpness. "After everything I said, why bother?" Amara paused, the question striking at a place she'd carefully guarded. She held his gaze, letting a few seconds pass before answering. "I took an oath to save lives, Mr. Davenport. Yours is no different." Richard's brow furrowed as if he were trying to find a response that fit his usual dismissive tone, but nothing came. The silence between them grew until Amara continued, her voice softening just enough to show a hint of her inner struggle. "Besides, this isn't about you. It's about doing what's right." Richard turned his head slightly, staring at the window as if the view outside could distract him from the gnawing discomfort that her words brought. It wasn't just the pain of his failing heart that kept him restless. It was the slow, suffocating realization that this woman, whom he had treated as beneath him, was the one holding the balance of his life. The days turned into weeks, each one filled with the routines of medical care and strained conversations. Amara's days were long, and the emotional toll began to wear on her. The hospital staff had noticed the dynamic between her and Richard, and whispers circulated among the nurses and residents. But Amara brushed off the curiosity and kept her focus on the task at hand. One evening, after another grueling day at the hospital, Amara returned to Richard's room to check his vitals. To her surprise, he was awake, his eyes watching her with a peculiar intensity. For a moment, neither spoke. "Amara," Richard said, breaking the silence. The sound of her name from his lips made her pause, her heart tightening. It was the first time he had addressed her without the clinical detachment that had marked all their interactions. "Yes," she replied, careful to keep her tone neutral. He hesitated, the weight of unspoken words visible on his face. "I don't expect you to care, but I wanted to say, I see what you do here, the way you care for your patients. It's more than admirable." Amara felt a spark of surprise at the compliment. It was the first sign of genuine acknowledgement she'd ever received from him. She met his eyes, searching for sincerity, and saw a flicker of vulnerability that hadn't been there before. "Thank you," she said quietly, the words hanging between them like a bridge that neither knew how to cross. The moment was interrupted by a knock at the door. James stepped into the room, his presence immediately easing the tension. He smiled at Amara before looking at his father, who shifted uncomfortably. "Amara, how's everything going?" James asked, his voice warm but tinged with the concern he felt every time he saw his father. Amara nodded, glancing at her clipboard. "Progress is steady. We're moving into the next phase of treatment soon." James's eyes shifted to Richard, searching for signs of change, not just physically but in the man he had known all his life. "That's good to hear." Richard looked at James, the son he had driven away with his pride and prejudice. For the first time, he noticed the exhaustion in James's eyes and the determination in Amara's. It struck him that they had built a life far more meaningful than the legacy he had tried to enforce. A pang of something, remorse perhaps, flashed through him, but he wasn't ready to acknowledge it aloud. The days continued, and the tension between Amara and Richard began to shift subtly. The silence grew less sharp, replaced by conversations that, while still guarded, were more human. Richard started asking questions about her work, not out of politeness, but genuine curiosity. And Amara, despite herself, responded, sharing stories of her most challenging cases and the patients who had left a mark on her soul. One afternoon, as Amara updated his chart, Richard spoke up again. "James told me about your parents," he said, his voice softer than before. "They must be proud of you." Amara looked up, startled. The mention of her parents, who had come to America with dreams that had paved the way for her career, brought a warmth to her eyes. "They are. They always taught me that kindness is a strength, not a weakness." Richard's gaze fell to his hands, frail and lined with veins. He let out a sigh, the sound filled with unspoken regrets. "I never learned that lesson." Amara didn't respond immediately. She had spent so long resenting this man, but seeing him now, humbled by his condition, she felt a pang of empathy. "It's never too late to learn, Mr. Davenport." The room fell silent again, but this time, it was not a silence of tension, it was one of reflection. The next week marked a turning point in Richard's treatment. The procedure Amara had been preparing for was delicate, a combination of surgery and post-operative care that would test not only her skill but the resilience of Richard's heart. The operating room buzzed with controlled urgency as Amara led the team, her eyes sharp with focus. Hours passed, marked by the steady beeping of monitors and the sterile metallic smell of the operating room. Every movement, every decision was crucial. The team around her followed her lead without hesitation, a testament to the respect she commanded in her field. When the surgery was finally over, Amara stepped back, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Richard's life now hung in the balance of recovery. She pulled off her gloves and looked at him, unconscious but alive, and felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. Days later, when Richard opened his eyes to find Amara standing by his bedside, he knew that something inside him had shifted irrevocably. The battle between pride and gratitude had reached its end. He was alive because of her, the woman he had once dismissed without a second thought. "Amara," he said, his voice raspy but clear. "Thank you." For the first time, Amara let a small, genuine smile touch her lips. "Rest now, Mr. Davenport. We'll talk when you're stronger." Richard nodded, a subtle but profound understanding passing between them. In that moment, the foundations of who he was began to crack, letting the light of something new and unfamiliar seep in. Amara stepped out of the room, feeling the beginnings of closure in her heart. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was a start. And sometimes, she thought, that was enough. The days following Richard's surgery were marked by a fragile quiet. The beeping of the heart monitor in his room became a steady soundtrack as he began the slow road to recovery. Each time Richard opened his eyes, he was reminded that he was still here, breathing, because of Amara, the woman he had belittled and rejected. It was a truth that weighed on him, a reminder of how deep his prejudice had run and how misplaced his pride had been. One morning, Richard awoke to find James sitting by his bedside. The sun streamed through the blinds, casting soft patterns on the hospital walls. James looked tired but resolute, his presence steady and unwavering. It was a look Richard hadn't seen in years, not since James was a boy, full of questions and hope. "Morning, Dad," James said, his voice cautious but warm. Richard cleared his throat, still unused to the strain of conversation. "James," he said, the word carrying more than just acknowledgement. It held an apology, a longing, and a tentative attempt at rebuilding. James looked down, his fingers intertwined, before meeting Richard's gaze. "You gave us quite a scare." "I know," Richard admitted, his voice breaking slightly. "And I'm sorry. Not just for that, but for everything before." The room was silent except for the rhythmic beeping of the monitor. James shifted, the weight of the words settling between them. He had waited years to hear even a fraction of that admission. "It wasn't easy watching Amara take care of you," James said finally. "Knowing everything that happened between you two, everything you said." Richard looked away, guilt tightening his chest. "I don't deserve her compassion. Or yours." James nodded, his expression softening but not yet free of the hurt that lingered. "No, you don't. But she did it anyway." They sat in silence, the past swirling around them, unspoken but understood. For the first time, Richard felt the weight of his legacy in a way he never had before, not as an empire built on wealth and influence, but as a chain that had bound him to a narrow vision of life. Later that day, Amara entered Richard's room for a routine checkup. The air between them felt different, heavier with the acknowledgement of what had transpired in the operating room and the days that followed. Richard watched her as she adjusted his foredrip, her movements precise and confident. He cleared his throat, hesitant but determined to speak. "Dr. Johnson," he began, using her title with newfound respect. She paused, meeting his eyes. There was still a barrier between them, but it was thinner now, almost translucent. "Yes, Mr. Davenport," she responded, her voice neutral but attentive. "I wanted to thank you," he said, the words halting and raw. "Not just for saving my life, but for doing it when you had every reason not to." Amara studied him for a moment, her eyes searching for sincerity. She found it in the subtle tremor of his voice and the weariness in his gaze. "I did it because it was the right thing to do," she said, her voice softening. "And because James needed me to." Richard's eyes flickered at the mention of his son. "I know I've been wrong about so many things. About you, about him, about what really matters." He took a shaky breath, the effort it took to speak making his voice quaver. "It's taken me too long to see that." Amara's expression softened, the walls she'd built over the years beginning to lower. She saw in Richard not just the man who had hurt her, but a man facing his mortality and the failures of his past. It was a moment of vulnerability she hadn't expected to see. "It's never easy to confront what we've done," Amara said, her voice gentle but firm. "But acknowledging it is a start." Richard nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. The room seemed to grow quieter, as if the world outside had paused to witness this moment. He looked at her, truly looked at her, not as an outsider, not as someone who didn't belong, but as a human being who had shown him compassion when he deserved none. "Do you think," he began hesitantly, "that there's a way to make amends?" Amara tilted her head slightly, considering his question. "Making amends isn't just about words, Mr. Davenport. It's about actions. It's about choosing to change, to be better, even when it's hard." Richard swallowed, the gravity of her words sinking into him. "Then I will try," he said, the promise small but sincere. Over the following weeks, Richard's recovery continued, and so did his efforts to mend the broken pieces of his relationships. He asked James to tell him more about his work, about the projects he was so passionate about. At first, James was guarded, but as Richard listened, truly listened, something shifted between them. The conversations became longer, filled with stories and ideas that Richard found himself admiring. For the first time, he saw his son not as an extension of the Davenport legacy, but as an individual with his own ambitions and values. Richard's newfound humility extended beyond his family. One afternoon, he asked Amara if she would join him for a short walk around the hospital wing. Surprised, she agreed, guiding him carefully as they moved at a slow pace. Nurses and patients glanced at them, a few whispering in recognition of the powerful man who was now dependent on the doctor he once disparaged. As they walked, Richard spoke. "I've spent my life building walls, around my family, my heart, my beliefs. And in the end, those walls left me alone." Amara nodded, listening without judgment. "Sometimes we build walls to protect ourselves, but they end up keeping out what matters most." He stopped, leaning slightly on the railing by the window that overlooked the city. "James told me once that integrity is more valuable than legacy. I didn't understand him then, but I think I'm beginning to now." They stood there in silence, the city's hum a distant reminder that life continued beyond the hospital walls. For Amara, seeing Richard in this moment was a strange, unexpected turning point. It didn't erase the pain of the past, but it made space for something else, perhaps acceptance, perhaps the first step toward forgiveness. "I don't know if I can fix everything I've broken," Richard said finally, his voice low. "But I want to try." Amara looked at him, the lines of his face softened by vulnerability. "Then start where you are, with the people who matter." Richard nodded, the realization settling in. For the first time, the path forward seemed clear, not as a map filled with calculated decisions, but as a journey of humility and healing. The weeks following Richard's declaration were filled with quiet moments of change. It wasn't dramatic or swift, but a steady unfolding, like winter giving way to spring. The man who had once epitomized unyielding pride and narrow-mindedness now found himself navigating a landscape where vulnerability and honesty took precedence over power and reputation. Richard was released from the hospital on a crisp autumn afternoon. The air was tinged with the smell of fallen leaves and the distant sound of traffic, a symphony of life moving forward. James stood beside his father as they left the hospital, the tension that had once marked their relationship replaced by a cautious understanding. Amara, having concluded her role as Richard's lead doctor, watched them from a hospital entrance, a small, hopeful smile touching her lips. "Thank you, Amara," Richard said, turning to face her. His voice was soft, the simple phrase carrying the weight of all that had changed. "I don't think I'll ever be able to repay you." Amara shook her head. "There's nothing to repay, Mr. Davenport. Just live better, be better. That's all anyone could ask." James's arm rested lightly on Richard's shoulder, guiding him toward the car that would take them home. The drive back to the Davenport estate was filled with a contemplative silence, punctuated only by the occasional question from Richard about James's work and the community initiatives he'd started. James answered, his voice warm and animated, filling the space between them with hope. When they arrived at the estate, Richard stood for a moment on the driveway, looking at the grand, imposing house that had once been his fortress. It felt different now, less like a symbol of his power and more like an echo of what he had lost and what he might still regain. Over the following months, Richard threw himself into learning. He read articles about Amara's research and the medical field that had fascinated her since she was a child. He asked James to take him to community events and workshops that supported equitable housing and education. At first, his presence drew skeptical glances and whispered questions. The wealthy tycoon attending grassroots events felt as out of place as a storm in spring. But gradually, as Richard's efforts proved genuine, those whispers turned into handshakes and nods of acknowledgement. Amara, observing from a distance, found herself processing the unexpected shift. Her encounters with Richard became less frequent, but they were marked by a quiet understanding. The sharp edge of her resentment had dulled, replaced by a cautious respect for a man who was trying, against all odds, to change. One evening, a formal invitation arrived at the Johnsons' apartment. It was handwritten, the elegant script unmistakably Elizabeth Davenport's. It was an invitation to a charity gala at the estate, a fundraiser for medical research and community development, co-hosted by Richard and James. Amara read the card, her heart conflicted but curious. The night of the event, the estate glowed with the light of chandeliers and laughter spilling from the grand hall. But unlike previous gatherings, this one had a different feel. The guest list included not only the wealthy and influential but doctors, activists, educators, and local community leaders. The formal gowns and suits were interspersed with modest attire, creating an atmosphere that was both sophisticated and welcoming. Amara and James entered the hall, greeted by Elizabeth, whose smile this time was genuine. "I'm so glad you came," she said, squeezing Amara's hand with a warmth that spoke of gratitude. They moved through the crowd, exchanging greetings with familiar faces and introducing themselves to new ones. When they found Richard, he was engaged in conversation with a young medical student about scholarships and mentorship programs. His face lit up when he saw James and Amara approaching, and he excused himself from the conversation. Amara, Richard said, his voice a little stronger than before but still tinged with humility. He gestured to the hall, where guests mingled, discussing both social change and medical breakthroughs. None of this would be happening if it weren't for you. Amara looked around, the energy of the room vibrant and real. It's not just me, Mr. Davenport, she replied. It's everyone here. But I'm glad to see you being part of it. Richard's eyes met hers, and they held a silent conversation, one that spoke of gratitude, regret, and the fragile yet powerful act of trying to change. I want to support more of this work, to do what I can, he said. James tells me you're setting up a new clinic in one of the underfunded neighborhoods. I'd like to help. Surprise flickered in Amara's eyes, quickly followed by a smile. We could use that help, she admitted. But it needs to be on the community's terms, not just ours. Agreed, Richard said, the words solid and sincere. As the night continued, conversations about plans and partnerships swirled, and the distance that had once kept them apart began to shrink. James stood to the side, watching his wife and father speak in a way that he had never imagined possible. The barriers that had defined his family were being torn down, brick by brick, replaced with a foundation built on understanding and growth. At the end of the night, as guests trickled out and the lights dimmed, Richard found himself walking alone to the edge of the grand hall, looking out over the gardens that stretched into the darkness. The night air was cool, carrying with it the distant sound of laughter and conversation. He felt James approach and stand beside him, the silence between them no longer a void but a shared space. Thank you for giving me a chance, James, Richard said, his voice breaking slightly. James looked at his father, the man who had once been impossible to reach, and saw someone different, a man learning, a man healing. We all deserve a chance to be better, James said, his tone gentle. Richard nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. In that moment, he understood that redemption wasn't a destination, it was a journey, one that he would walk for the rest of his life, one step at a time. From across the room, Amara caught sight of them, standing side by side. She felt a sense of closure settle in her chest, warm and unexpected. The journey hadn't been easy, and forgiveness was still a process, but tonight was a beginning. And sometimes, beginnings were more powerful than endings. Thank you for joining us on this exciting journey. If you liked this story of redemption and the power of forgiveness, click like on this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories that touch the heart. And don't forget to check out the other videos appearing on your screen right now for more inspiring content. Until next time.